Hello and welcome to Tutorials by 42ID. In this video, we will talk about authentication and authorization for a Firebase application using third-party OAuth providers such as Google, Facebook, or GitHub. Now, if you're new to Firebase and would like to learn more about building applications using front-end JavaScript framework such as AngularJS with a Firebase backend, then check out our starter tutorial at 42id.com. For those of you who are new, Firebase is a document database that provides real-time update to all clients connected to it. Now, in addition to providing database-centric functionality, Firebase also makes it very easy to integrate OAuth authentication into your application. In this webcast, we'll see how to do just that. Now, if you take a moment and consider it, you're not going to be performing authentication and authorization in complete isolation. If your application has an authentication requirement, then most likely you have sections of your application that are open to the public and others that are accessible only to registered users. You also most likely have user-centric information that you like to store. So not only would your application require means to perform authentication, but you also need to hook in routing, store user profile information, and secure this data on Firebase. We're going to take care of all of these in this tutorial. First, let's take a look at the final application that we will be building. We have a home page and an authenticated page. Home page is visible to all users, and authenticated page is only visible to users who have logged into our application. Our application provides the ability to log in using Google or GitHub. As you can see, clicking on the authenticated page does not navigate to that page since we are not logged in. However, once we log in using any one of the two providers below, we will be able to navigate to that page. Now, clicking on the logout button takes us back to the home page. Now, let's look at our code. This application is built using Node.js for the server component and AngularJS with Firebase on the client side. The final client-side code is under the public folder. We have split the application into 3 stages to illustrate the gradual progression of our application. Let's start with stage 1. We'll modify the route for our index page in our Node.js application to render the client code for stage 1. Now let's take a look at this client-side code. Looking at the index page, we see 2 buttons or links defined, one for the home page and another for the authenticated page. The buttons are hooked to a handler that will change the state and thereby trigger the appropriate route and render the corresponding view for that state. Switching over to the app.js file, we see the 2 state-based routes defined using Angular UI router. Let's run this and see our results. As you can see, we have the links for the home page and the authenticated page. Clicking on the 2 buttons allows us to navigate between those 2 views. We can see that the routes have been hooked in and they are set up. Next, in stage 2, we'll hook up the login buttons to authenticate against Google+ and GitHub. In order to do this, we have to do a couple of things. 1, obtain the client keys for authentication from the providers, in this case from Google and GitHub, and associate these keys with Firebase. Firebase then does the rest for us. So head over to Google Developers Console and create an authorization ID for our application. Under API and Auth, click on Credentials and then create a new client ID. Google will provide you with the client ID and client secret. You will have to specify the redirect URI and JavaScript origin URL. Enter the information as shown here, replacing this section here with the name of your Firebase database. Similarly, head over to your other provider, which in this case is GitHub, and under Applications, create a new authorization token. Just like we did for Google+, specify the authorization callback URL by entering this information, replacing this section with the name of your Firebase database. Next, log into your Firebase console and under Login and Auth, navigate to your provider section and enter the client ID and client secret for the providers. Do the same for any other providers you may want to include. Next, let's write a login controller that will interact with the Firebase Authentication service. This controller will be responsible for providing the handlers for our login buttons on our index page. Taking a look here under Stage 2, this is our login controller. Here we inject in the Firebase Auth and the Firebase Object services into our controller. We first get the reference to our Firebase database, and next we obtain an object that encapsulates the authentication services provided by Firebase. We then register a callback function on the object that is triggered anytime the authentication state changes. That is, whenever a user logs in or logs out, this method would be invoked. The callback function receives an object as a parameter that contains all the details of this authenticated state. On successful login, this object contains the user ID written by the provider. We can use this to check our Firebase database to see if we already have information for this user. And if not, we create a new user object and store it under the user's data node. Next, we hook in our login buttons to invoke the authentication service, passing in the provider we are using. Now let's run this and check out our results. So we are successfully able to log in using the providers. However, we still haven't hooked in our routes to take this into account. Let's do this in Stage 3. Next, in Stage 3, we will add functionality to our authenticated route to only navigate to it if the user has successfully authenticated. We do this by using the resolve property of the UI router. Here we call the require auth promise provided by Firebase. This promise resolves successfully if the user is logged in, otherwise it rejects the promise. This is all that we would need to protect our page. Let's run this and check it out. And there it is. We just created an application that authenticates against OAuth providers using Firebase services, stores the user information within Firebase, and also ties in routing for public and authenticated access. One final step that we need is to set up the security rules within Firebase database so that the users can only see their data within Firebase. We do this by going back to the Firebase console, and under Security and Rules, we specify the following rule. This rule indicates that under the users node in the database, only authenticated users have access to their data. So, to quickly recap, we created an AngularJS application that uses Firebase for authenticating against popular OAuth providers. We tied in routing to enable public as well as protected page access. We persisted new user information within Firebase, and finally, we protected this information within Firebase by specifying security rules. The source code is available on GitHub at this location. Feel free to ping us at the latest Brian or Yanamega Info if you have any questions or comments. We would love to hear from you. And continue to check out our website at www.42id.com for more information.